Hey, this is Brett's Books. Brett and some books. We're reading Am I Blue? The short story for this video is Holding by Lois Lowry. Would you come and be with me, Willie, just for a few days? My father asked on the phone. He hadn't called me Willie since I was maybe 4, and his voice was breathless, panicky, as if the air in his New York apartment had disappeared suddenly. The kind of voice you hear on 911 when people call gasping and sobbing to report that the fire has almost reached their room or the rapist with the knife is now at the open window. I'll be there, Dad. I think I can get there by tomorrow afternoon. Don't worry about meeting me. I'll take a cab from the airport. I know you have school, Willie. I know it's Dad, it's all right. I want to come, and Mom wants me to. You'll be okay till I get there, won't you? Do you have anybody with you? Yes. His voice was a little steadier. I'll be fine. I am fine. There are friends here. Stuart and Amanda. They're here. You remember Stuart and Amanda? You met them last summer. I remember. Amanda was the one with the whole lot of hair. He laughed slightly. Yeah, she's the one with the hair. Wasn't she an actress? Well, Dad said, an unsuccessful one. He lowered his voice. I should shut up or she'll hear me. Anyway, they're here. They got here last night, and the other people are coming and going. Trisha's here now. You met her too. Remember the magazine editor in the apartment next door? She's in the kitchen right now making coffee. She said to tell you hi. Yeah, hi back. Anyway, a lot of people have been in and out. God, Willie, an aneurysm. Wouldn't Chris laugh to die of something that nobody can even spell? Dad laughed briefly, bitterly. Then he gasped again and went breathless again, and I waited while he fought with tears. Finally, he took a deep breath and said, Everybody loved Chris so much. I did too, Dad, I told him before I said goodbye and went to pack. I called John, my best friend since we bashed each other over the head with blocks in my nursery school. I'm not going to be in school for a few days, I told him. Tell Moynihan to give me an incomplete for now on the history test, okay? And I'll make it up when I get back. Sure, you sick? No, I'm flying to New York in the morning, to my dad's. Chris died yesterday. Jesus, your dad's wife died? Bummer. They weren't married, reminded John, continuing the lie. I'd been having to live with for so long that it had come easily. They only lived together. Yeah, for like 100 years. 8, actually. Almost 9. Same thing. So, would you tell your dad for me? I know he probably doesn't remember me or anything, but tell him I'm really sorry. He remembers you. I'll tell him. He'll appreciate it. Jesus, I hate that when people die or when people's wives die, even if I never met them, John said gloomily before he hung up. I threw a few final things into the suitcase my mom had pulled down from the hall closet shelf. Shorts and running shoes in case I had got a chance to be outdoors, in case Dad didn't need me with him every minute. A gray V-neck sweater I'd never worn. Some relative gave it to me last Christmas. A framed photograph of Laura that I could show Dad. He was always interested in hearing about my girlfriends. Then I rummaged around, found a not too shabby looking necktie, blue and green paisley, and smoothed it out on top of the clothes so that maybe the suitcase lid would keep it pressed flat. I figured I'd need a tie for the memorial service. Turned out it wouldn't have mattered. People wore everything from jeans to pinstripes. Amanda, the actress with the hair, and with Stuart, the stockbroker husband, wore something that looked like a paratrooper's uniform, but it probably cost $1,000, and a guy wearing suspenders over a t-shirt. I wore the tie because it looked okay and because my dad liked it, and he said that Chris would have liked it, that Chris had always thought blue and green was a great combination of colors. Chris always said some football team ought to have blue and green for their official colors, Dad said. Chris chose the wallpaper in the guest bathroom, he pointed out. Blue and green. Chris did this, Chris did that, said this, said that. People milled around the apartment after the service talking about Chris, remembering Chris, keeping Chris alive for a few more hours. Then they finally, gradually stopped chatting and stopped patting Dad's back, stopped sipping coffee, and they stopped cleaning up the kitchen. Then they didn't have anything left to talk about, so they went home, and then Chris was really dead, and Dad and I were alone. I stood there in the blue and green guest bathroom and unknotted my blue and green tie in front of the mirror while my father watched from the doorway. "I'm glad you got your mother's blonde hair," he said. He ran one hand through his own, or what was left of it. Dad's hair was dark and he was going bald. I made some sort of aw shucks remark, which is what I do if anyone says anything about the way I look. "No, really," Dad said. "You're a handsome boy, Will. Doesn't your girl, what's her name, Laura, doesn't she ever tell you that?" "Gee whiz," shrug, golly, blush, shuffle. "Yeah, Dad, she tells me that." He grinned. "Of course, I've always been partial to blonde myself, as you know." Chris was blonde, like my mother. I worked the tie loose and yanked it through the button-down collar of my shirt. "I've noticed that, Dad," I said, laughing a little, keeping it casual. "Chris thinks so, too, that you're so good-looking," he commented. I would have let it pass, but he tried to correct himself. Chris thought is what I meant, Willie. I just automatically said it the other way. I haven't gotten used to it yet." "Oh shit, Willie, I don't think that I can." Then his face fell apart and he slumped in the doorway, one hand grabbing at the woodwork like a failed mountain climber suddenly clutching in desperation at the last rock between earth and empty air. He made horrible, harsh, choking sounds. I held him for a while. We were the same height now, me and my dad, for the first time. When I was little, he used to measure me and mark the place on the wall in the garage. Age 2, age 3, age 4, and 5, all in pencil and his orderly architect's printing, so neat that it always made Mom laugh. Nothing after age 5. Dad left us when I was 5. When I was 14, I was tall as my mother, but that was 3 years ago. It took me 3 more years to catch up with my dad. Finally, I steered him to the living room. I shoved the cushions from the corner of the couch, where some well-meaning friend had arranged them in a bright-colored pile, and we sat huddled there and held each other. I rocked him back and forth while he cried, and eventually he was quieter, just shuddering now and then, while he caught his breath. I remembered something, suddenly. I remembered that my mother had held me in the same way, had rocked me just like this, stroking my back, while I sobbed and howled until finally nothing was left but the shudders of rage and grief and fear that were the same I felt that I felt from him now. My mother had done that for me when I was 5 and had lost the person I loved the most. So I understood how to do it for him now. Later, we changed our clothes and went out running. 5 miles at a good clip, then we shared a pizza. Loaded, no anchovies. My dad loves anchovies, but he laughed and said he'd make the sacrifice for me just this once. "I hate that when people act like martyrs over anchovies," I told him. "I hate that when people talk with beer foam on their upper lips," he told me back. I stayed 4 days. We didn't do much. Ran a few miles each day, rented movies each night, talked a lot. Friends stopped by in the evenings. I offered him help to clean stuff out, maybe give Chris's clothes away, but he said he wasn't ready for that. We sorted out old photographs, some going back to when I was a rugrat with 3 chins. Mom was in the old ones, holding me on her lap, then holding me by the hand. Then she wasn't there anymore. Dad was with Chris then in the snapshots, and I had disappeared, reappearing only during summer visits. Skinny legs, baggy shorts, band-aids, big ears, bad haircuts. Chris was always taking me off to spruce me up, but it never seemed to work. The new shoes got scuffed and the new shorts got torn. It was all there in the photographs. Me and Chris sometimes, Dad's shadow falling into the front of the picture from where he stood with the camera, or me and Dad grinning and squinting into the sun, and Chris's shadow sneaking into the foreground. Some were of Dad and Chris, their arms folded around each other, making faces toward me, and there was my skinny, shrimpy shadow reaching across the sidewalk almost to their feet. By the third day, Dad didn't cry anymore when he looked at the photographs, and he stopped getting choked up when we ate the things that Chris had especially loved, like rum raisin ice cream. And so I went home. I told my mom that Dad would be okay, that he's going back to work next week, and that I had promised to call him each Sunday night. My mother still cares about Dad, and she had liked Chris a lot, which surprised me when I was a little kid, and surprises me still. I went back to school on Friday and did the stuff you do when you've been gone for a few days. I collected makeup work, made promises to teachers about reading the missed chapters, scheduled retake quizzes, and collected foul-smelling forgotten socks from my gym locker. I could break up a whole riot just by tossing these into the middle of the mob, I told John, holding up the ripe, rolled-up socks out in front of me. Better than mace, better than tear gas. John sank into a cowering crouch and did his beaten-down slave imitation. No, boss, he whimpered. Not the sock torture, anything but the sock torture. I tossed the socks into a trash container in the corner of the locker room, saving my mother from a potentially traumatic laundry experience. Where were you all week, Will? Someone called from the doorway. You missed the swimming meet. I had to go to New York, I called back. His father's wife died, John explained on my behalf, but whoever it was who had asked that had already left. The door banged shut behind him. Thank you for your inquiry and your concern, John said with exaggerated courtesy to the closed door. Sensitive asshole, he added cheerfully. The lie was back, and I couldn't live with it anymore because it killed Chris a second time. It killed him in a way that wouldn't make him laugh, in the way that an unspelled word like aneurysm would. Chris wasn't my father's wife, I said, shoving wrinkled gym clothes into my bag. John shrugged. Whatever, he said, significant other than. I ended the lie then, and gave him a tiny sliver of my life. Back to Chris, and my father, and to myself. Chris was a guy. Yeah, right, John said. I mean it, I told him. My voice had a brittle, angry edge to it. Thank you for your sensitive concern, asshole. You mean what? John asked, looking up from the towel he was folding. Chris was a guy. You mean not your father's? John looked confused. My father's significant other, as you put it, was a guy, I said, very clearly looking at him. All these years? What's it been, like 8 or 9 years since we were little kids? It's always been a guy, but you said. I gave him what I thought was a disdainful, condescending look. I did my John Gielgud accent. I ain't nothing, my good man. You made certain assumptions. I allowed you to do so. It suited my purposes. He went into his part of the act that we always did together. Two British guys meeting on the street, looking down their noses at each other, curling their lips. I see, he said. I despise when that occurs, and when people allow other people to make faulty assumptions. Quite so, I replied. Terribly tasteless of me. Indeed, John said. We dropped the act. We could have dropped the whole thing right there, I suppose. But I started to cry. I hadn't cried the whole time at Dad's. Not at the service, not back at the apartment, when everybody talked about Chris and the crazy things he liked to do, like how he once had a couple of frequent flyer tickets, and so he planned a surprise weekend trip for him and Dad, and they went to Omaha, where other people would have gone to San Francisco or Las Vegas or New Orleans. But Chris picked friggin' Omaha off a map, and they went, and they had a great time. And once he took tap dancing lessons. The guy was a lawyer, for God's sake. And he took tap dancing lessons and bought cornball pointy shoes and tippy-tapped around the apartment like Tommy Toon just for the fun of it. My dad loved it. So did I. He was a great guy, I sobbed, sitting there on that crummy wooden bench in a locker room that smelled of sweat and mildew and fungus and hormones. A radiator was hissing in the corner. John watched me for a minute. Then he set down his stuff and shoved his locker door closed. And he came and he sat beside me. After a while, he put his arm around me. "It's okay," he said, and he held on to me really tight. "It's okay." We sat together for a long time, and it was like the way I held my father until his tears ended. Finally, I could talk again, and I pulled away from him. "Penalty for holding," I announced, doing my Super Bowl referee into the mic sound, with the odd little smirky smile at the end of it. "For holding out," John said. I shrugged. "Holding on," I told him. "God, you smell like you overdosed on right guard." John stood up. "I hate that," he said, "when someone interrupts a male bonding session with an armpit evaluation." I laughed and punched him gently and collected my stuff. Then I went to continue my life, which had changed a little, as lives do every day, inching by microspecks forward toward whatever surprises are coming next.